In my previous post and in my sermon last week, I took a very black and white stance on the biblical command to honor the authorities God has placed in our lives. It apparently left many of you as unsettled as it did me. Having let the black and white approach sit for a bit, I want to talk about the tension we live in as Christians who live in a heavenly kingdom that demands many things of us in a fallen world that challenges all of them. In biblical ethics, there's an idea called absolutism. That means that when God commands something, the thing he commands is a good thing. It's absolutely a good command because it stems from God's nature. And yet we live in a fallen world, and we will be put in positions where it seems that we have to choose one of God's absolute commands over another. A couple examples. Do the Hebrew midwives obey Pharaoh's command to kill newborn baby boys or not? Well, they didn't, and they lied. Okay, we're not supposed to lie, but it sure seems like they made the right choice by lying in order to save the lives of the Hebrew boys. In 1 Samuel, we read the story of David and his men eating showbread in the temple, and that showbread was consecrated for the priest alone. But feeding the men to preserve life was more important than the lie David told to get the bread and the fact that he ate the bread. Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, a day when no work was to be done. And the Pharisees questioned him about it, and he answered, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" Corrie ten Boom provides a more modern example. Her family lied so that the Nazis couldn't discover the Jewish people they were hiding. Most of us would look at that and say that was the right choice. Or what about someone in an abusive marriage? The sanctity of marriage and the command to keep the covenant clashes with all the principles that surround the Christian perspective on protecting human dignity. Christian ethicists have responded to this reality in several related but different ways. Unqualified absolutism makes the argument that there will never be any qualifications to the absolute commands. So, if we're in a situation where it looks like we're going to have to break one of God's commands in order to honor another command, we're just not seeing the third way out that God will always provide. We will never have to break one law to keep another law. Qualified or conflicting absolutists put a different spin on it. We're never justified in breaking one of God's commands, even if it is to keep another of God's commands. But we will have to, because we live in a fallen world. So when we do, we need to pray for forgiveness because what we did was wrong. Graded absolutism takes yet another approach. Because we live in a fallen world, we will be put in positions where we have to choose to follow one of God's commands in such a way that we will have to break one or another of his commands. The term graded simply means that there is a biblical hierarchy of what are the greater commands. We're choosing a greater good, and that's not a sin for which we need to ask forgiveness. Jesus also taught about the least and the greatest commandments and the weightier matters of the law. The Bible speaks of different degrees of punishment and reward. Norman Geisler and Josh McDowell compare this to a jetliner taking off, which places the laws of aerodynamics and the laws of gravity into conflict. As it lifts off, the aircraft does not break the law of gravity, but it emphasizes the law of aerodynamics. When it lands, gravity moves front and center again. Neither one ceases to be true and compelling, but they take turns superseding each other. The bottom line is this. We recognize that we live in a world full of tension. That means we're going to be put into situations where God is asking us to do two things that are both very important, but sometimes we're going to have to choose to do the one that is more important. The typical pyramid of values looks something like this. At the top is respect for the source of the law, that's God. Next is respect for moral beings, that's us, persons. Third is respect for animate things, animals. And fourth is respect for inanimate things like stuff. Jesus summarizes all of this in what's often called the law of love. Love God first and then love others. He never tells us to love things, but he does tell us we are to steward them. So let's talk about the biblical command to be obedient to the authorities in our lives in light of graded absolutism, which is where I land in the discussion. There will indeed be times where it would be wrong for us to obey the commands of government because it would force us to break the commands of God. I don't think there's any dispute about this in Christian circles. We all know this. The key things are if the government asks us to deny our faith or to stop preaching the Bible, or to commit sin. These are obvious examples where we obey the higher law of obedience to God. Our holiness and the spreading of the gospel is on the line. These cannot be exempted. The stories of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are classic examples from the Old Testament. We don't bow to idols. So this brings us to the weirds, a phrase a friend introduced me to as a description of what's happening right now, and it seemed appropriate. What does it look like for we Christians to navigate the tension of feeling like the government we are called to obey is becoming intrusive and perhaps even oppressive? In a book called Ethics for a Brave New World, John and Paul Feinberg write about civil disobedience. They phrase it this way. What drives one to commit an act of civil disobedience is a decision based on the following. A moral decision or judgment that a law or activity is unjust. B, after normal channels of addressing the injustice have proven fruitless. And C, the moral objections to this injustice of the law outweigh the moral reasons in favor of obedience. I like this template, so let's run with it. Civil disobedience is justified if a law is unjust. That can't simply mean a law that I don't like, or a law that makes me uncomfortable, or a law that inconveniences me. It doesn't even mean that it seems legally unjust or seems to violate our American sense of justice. Here we're talking about moral injustice. If something is unjust, it means it's breaking a higher moral law that comes from God. In other words, the law would be the kind of law such that if I followed it, I would break the higher moral law of God. Second, civil disobedience is justified after normal channels of addressing the injustice have proven fruitless. One of the reasons the civil rights movement spilled into the streets was because normal channels of justice were proving to be fruitless. There was no good reason to believe that the structure in place in our society would address the issue, but still they had to try. Just thinking that normal channels won't get us anywhere isn't reason to skip that step. We're talking about civil disobedience after we've exhausted normal channels. Civil disobedience is justified if the moral objections of the law outweigh the moral reasons in favor of obedience. So that's really graded absolutism. I'm weighing the biblical command to be obedient to the God-ordained authorities in my life with the biblical command to obey the God who is over those authorities. If it's clear that those are clashing, I must obey God. So let's look at the tensions we're feeling right now as Christians and as United States citizens. I don't actually want to address how we respond purely as American citizens to concerns about constitutional encroachment or overreaching power. I want to focus on the Christian justification of civil disobedience, not the constitutional or political one. It's not that I don't think that the other discussion is worth having. It's just not my primary focus. I think we can summarize all the points from the Feinbergs by having us ask three questions. Number one, is what the government asking us to do biblically unjust? Is it demanding that we deny our faith, shut up about the gospel, or commit sin? I can't see how the commands involving state restrictions are doing this in and of themselves. The question we have to ask ourselves is if there is a ripple effect such that commands that in and of themselves are not unjust could lead to something unjust if we aren't careful. So let me give a silly but obvious example. The state would like us to wear masks in Menards, as would Menards. But what if someone collapses in Menards and they need mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? Well, obviously, we would take off both masks and we would break the law. And the reason we would do that is that saving a human life is more important than keeping the mask on or social distancing. So the rule about masks was not unjust in and of itself, and it ought to be obeyed as much as possible. But that obedience becomes unjustified if the obedience overrides a greater command, which in this case is to protect the value and the dignity of human life. This brings us to the second question. Do government restrictions force me to disobey a higher law of God? Well, hopefully the example I just gave makes it clear that obviously there are reasons that we would step outside of restrictions. It's not because we're trying to be rebellious or because we've decided we just don't care about authority. It's not because we're trying to shake our fist at the state because they're frustrating us. It's actually because we're being obedient to a higher law and we really care about that higher authority. So it's actually not lawlessness, it's actual lawfulness. And in the example I just gave, I think anyone would see that. So what about breaking other government mandates that aren't quite so clear? Well, right now, the governor is outlining a lot of restrictions, though as I record this, she has just announced we're moving into phase 4 in Michigan on Friday. In and of itself, the restrictions that have been in place do not seem to have been asking me or any other Christian to break some higher law of God. So as much as is possible, I could honor them in good faith as a Christian. But I think what Christians are struggling with is that there appear to be situations that, while not as obvious as the person needing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, are examples of what I would call spiritual or relational resuscitation. They also seem very essential in ways that might not make sense from a secular perspective. This is typically in church lingo what we call ministry or fellowship. We toss those words out lightly at potluck sometimes, but what we mean is that there are genuine needs, genuine spiritual needs that must be met. So they're not biological needs like food or drink or oxygen, but they are life-giving and life-sustaining activities. And it would sure seem that in the biblical hierarchy of things, the flourishing of human beings is very important, especially their flourishing in their relationship with God. But even as I say that, I hope we're all feeling that tension right away, because the whole reason we're trying not to commingle with other families or do non-essential things is because we could spread a virus that takes human life. So here we are at the tension. Foolhardiness or a carefree attitude about personal protection protocol could potentially lead to someone else's death. And God knows I don't want to be responsible for someone else's death if I can at all help it. And yet there are times that if we're not present with people in a physical way, we have legitimate concern of a spiritual or emotional plunging off the deep end that could also have very serious consequences, potentially either physical or spiritual death. So there's no doubt that our presence is not only life-giving, but sometimes directly life-sustaining. So this is a rock and a hard place, right? This is thinking with both hands that I've referred to in previous episodes. I landed hard on obeying the government on my last post and in my message this last Sunday, because I don't think we take it seriously enough, or at least we don't wrestle with it enough. We can become very cavalier with an attitude that says, I just don't care what the authorities of my life say. I'm going to do what I want. But that's very different from thoughtfully thinking with both hands and weighing out what our obligations are as Christians as we best understand them. So that's very different from making a decision with fear and trembling. If someone who's a follower of Christ says to me, you know what, screw it, I just don't care, I'm going to do what I want. Okay, we're going to very strongly and very bluntly disagree. But if you're telling me that you're wrestling with these dual obligations you have as a Christian, and that through prayer and discussion with other Christians, you're saying, actually, I really feel like my greater obligation in this situation is to do this. This is what the law of love demands of me. Well, that's a very different thing. We might still disagree, but we can disagree with a great deal of respect. Of course, we have to be very, very careful that we're not using this as an excuse just to do what we want. That would be an example of turning liberty into license, of taking good freedoms and turning them into something destructive of self or others. I mean, Paul reminds us, not everything permissible is beneficial. We have to be very careful that we study and guard our hearts so that the desire that motivates us is a desire to honor God's plan for our lives and the lives of those around us and the church. And we seek to do this as well as we can. If that's the process we're going through, I have deep respect for that. If we're not taking that process seriously, then I have grave concerns. Third question, am I maximizing the use of normal channels of addressing what I believe is injustice? The early church provides a model of using the channels available to them. This is modeled first by the Apostle Paul, claiming his Roman citizenship to protect himself. Over the next few centuries, Christian apologists would write letters to or go in front of Roman governors, and they would state their case on behalf of Christians. In the United States, we have a lot of channels for addressing something that we believe is unjust or unfair. We can call, write, post on social media, start online petitions, write letters to the editor, put signs on our yard, can even file lawsuits. I don't think any of those things are in and of themselves unbiblical responses. When that doesn't work to address genuine injustice, we move into a time-honored tradition in Christian history of civil disobedience, which is simply stepping out of the boundaries so that we can do what is right and so that our presence will be felt. There's no doubt that the initial lockdowns for the purpose of protecting human life could become, and perhaps are becoming, unjust if they actually begin to have the opposite effect and start to harm human life more than helping it. Plenty of people are talking about the economic ripple effect and the impact real poverty has on human health and life. Others are rightly commenting on how mental health issues are climbing during this time of lockdown and how hospitals are being forced to cancel operations such that people are dying of other diseases that would not have normally taken their lives. These are all part of the discussion of addressing just and unjust laws right now. In fact, here in Michigan, some hospitals have already filed a lawsuit about this issue. And I would note, they're going through normal channels of addressing what they believe is injustice, which I believe is not only a good idea from a civil perspective, but I think is the right approach from a biblical perspective. Churches are simultaneously wanting to honor the authorities while at the same time insisting that what we see as our essential role in the community be taken seriously by the state as it contemplates rules and guidelines. Several weeks ago, I wrote a letter to the governor expressing my hope about how she will handle the situation when it comes to churches reopening. The vast majority of churches are seeking to be obedient while maximizing normal channels, even up to the point of filing lawsuits in states where they believe churches have been unfairly denied freedom when other similar venues have been open. I believe maximizing normal channels is the biblically correct way to do it. Will there come a point where the larger church community begins to say that a law that started well and with just intentions has now become a law that is becoming overbearing and unjust, particularly when it relates to churches gathering? Well, that could be. That's surely part of the discussion that is happening nationwide within denominations and individual churches. In my discussion with other pastors here in Traverse City and within the leadership at our church, there's widespread agreement that we're still in a place where we want to and believe we should honor the restrictions that are in place while recognizing there may come a day when we feel like we no longer can. That day has not yet arrived, and considering the governor's move to move us into phase 4, I don't think it will. May we pray that that trend continues, and may we pray for wisdom for all of us.